guys, it's Mr. Hefner again, and just like in the past, I'm coming to you today from inside the New York Public Library. Just makes me feel a little bit like I'm teaching at Hogwarts or something like that. Today we're going to take a look at a folk tale, and it's a specific type of folk tale called a trickster tale. Now, we had a little bit of the trickster tale already when we took a look at the Fox and the Crow, the fable. Now, that was a fable, but it's still a trickster tale because the fox is really kind of wily as a character. Foxes show up in a lot of stories, and they often outsmart someone else. Now, in a lot of folk tales where the trickster comes along, the trickster outsmarts a few people, and then sometimes the trickster sort of gets burned before the story's over and gets caught in his own web of deception. So the piece we're going to look at today is actually a North African folk tale, and it's called Goha and the Pot. And that's a funny title, but I'll explain why pots are particularly important if you're in North Africa at this time and in this story. So let's get started. All right. As I said, today we're taking a look at a story called Goha and the Pot, and it's a North African folk tale. It's been retold, so you'll find this story in many different versions, and we're not concerned with authors in this story because we're looking more at the folklore rather than the written version of the folklore. Our essential question today is going to be like everything else in this unit. What are the elements of, but this time it's going to be what are the elements of a trickster tale? You see, some of the other things we're reading are subgenres of folktale. Folktales are any stories that are passed down word of mouth, oftentimes to entertain or teach a lesson, and so some of the other things that we've read fall into this. So we're going to focus on this one word right here. We're going to focus on this being a trickster tale. Now, trickster tales are traditional stories passed on by word of mouth. That's why it's a folk tale. And they involve these things. They involve deceit. So deceit is when you try to mislead someone on purpose. A lot of times there's a clever underdog who outwits a slower character. Like I said, tricksters often get caught in their own traps. And many African tales feature human tricksters. So we had the story of the Fox and the Crow, where the fox was the trickster, but it was an animal. Another famous trickster story that you might be familiar with is the Gingerbread Man. That's the one where the elderly lady's baking gingerbread cookies, and when she opens the oven, he jumps out and he runs away, says, "Run, run fast as you can't catch me, I'm the Gingerbread Man." And usually through 3 different adventures, that would be a motif. He tricks someone to help him out, and he moves on and runs on later on until finally there's a fox again at the end, and the fox usually says, "I'll help you, but you got to come closer. No, you got to come a little closer yet, just a little bit closer yet." And ultimately at the end, the fox usually snaps up the Gingerbread Man and eats him. So the trickster gets caught in his own web of deceit once again. Now this story comes to us from North Africa. This would be the Mediterranean Sea right in here. And that whole big Africa would be down below this here. So we're looking at, these are largely desert regions up here, and that's going to be important to us in this particular story. Our literary tools that we'll be looking at today are obviously the definition of folktale. It's any story passed by word of mouth from generation to generation, as I said. So a lot of the other things we've done might fall into the category of folktale as well. You know AIM. We've talked about that before. Another name for aim is just author's purpose. In other words, what is the author trying to do in this? In the case of a trickster tale, the aim is usually to show beware of tricksters. And then we have personification. So you know that personification is when an author gives human characteristics to non-human or even inanimate things. A weeping willow tree, for example. Trees don't actually cry, but because of what it looks like, we've given it the personification of a weeping willow. We've given it a bit of human emotion. We're going to look for personification in here as well. Now, we're going to actually do this story together right here in the video because it's so short. And as we read through the story, add to your Cornell Notes, look for characters, the type of characters we have, quick plot summary. Look for the trickster, see if you can find that trickster, determine what in fact is the aim or the purpose of the author in this story. So look for the characters, elements of plot, as I said, identify the elements of a trickster tale, look for that trickster to deceive some and then get caught in his own kind of web of deceit before the story's over, and then the personification we'll have as well in this story. So here's the story. I'm just going to leave this on the screen. Hopefully the text is big enough on your screen that you can read it. and I'll just read as we go along here. One day, many, many years ago, Goha wanted to fix a meal for his family. He found that he needed a big pot, so he went to his next-door neighbor to ask if he might borrow a big brass pot. The neighbor was reluctant to let him borrow the pot, but Goha promised that he would return it to his neighbor the following day. To the surprise of the neighbor, Goha returned the next day with the big brass pot that he had borrowed and another one, smaller than the first. The neighbor felt that Goha must have made a mistake since he had lent Goha one pot, but Goha said that there was no mistake at all. He explained that overnight, the pot he had borrowed went into labor and gave birth to this nice, shiny little pot, and Goha insisted that the small pot also belonged to his neighbor. A few days later, Goha returned to the same neighbor, and he asked if he could borrow another pot. This time, the neighbor didn't have any trouble giving him two big pots, thinking that Goha would return with more pots anyway. And indeed, when Goha returned the two big pots, he also brought two smaller, shining pots, much to the surprise of the neighbor. The next time Goha knocked on his neighbor's door, before he could even say a word, the neighbor gave him a basket full of big pots. In fact, he gave Goha all the pots he had in his possession. His neighbor did not stop there, however. He even helped to carry the pot to Goha's house. Days passed, then weeks, and the neighbor began to worry, but he did not mention his concern to Goha, hoping that Goha would come by someday with a room full of pots. After 3 whole months had gone by, the neighbor decided to go to Goha to inquire about his pots. Upon inquiry, Goha, with a very sad face, said to his neighbor, "My dear neighbor, I am saddened to tell you that your pots are all dead." The neighbor was furious, and he shouted, "Are you a madman? Pots don't die." Then Goha said very quietly, "My dear neighbor, you were very willing to accept the fact that pots can have babies, weren't you? Well, for goodness sake, why don't you accept that they can also die?" All right, that's our story right there. We have two tricksters in a way. One is successful, that's Goha, and the other is the neighbor who thinks he's going to pull the wool over Goha's eyes, but he's not able to pull that off. So think about these things, especially if you're working with a partner right now, as we would be doing in class. Why is this a folk tale? Think for a moment about that. Why is this a folk tale? All right, so by itself, you wouldn't know. It's entertaining. It's got, common, simple characters. But to make it a folktale, you would have to know for a fact that it's been passed along generation to generation. And we told you that. So you couldn't tell it's a folktale if it's the first time you've seen it and there was no background information. You need the background information to be able to determine that. How about, why is it a trickster tale? Now that one's a lot easier. Think about that for a second. Why is this a trickster tale? All right, exactly. It's a trickster tale because Goha is able to pull the wool over his neighbor's eye. This is almost like, sometimes when people do something like a shooting pool with one another, somebody will be terrible. I'm a terrible pool player, but I'll play you anyway. Oh, yeah, I've lost 3 games. Maybe if we put a little money on this, it'll give me something to play for. And as soon as there's money on the next game, the not so good pool player suddenly receives like talent from God or something. It's luring other people into that sense of trust, so then you can use that trust against them. And in this case, Goha, he took his time. Borrow a pot, give a pot back. Goha's actually short a pot at this point. Borrow 2 pots, give more pots back. Goha's even short more pots. But he counted on the fact that the neighbor would try to trick him. And when the neighbor gives him all of his pots, Goha takes them all and never returns them. And his explanation at the end is, you thought they could have babies, so why can't they die? We know what happened. Goha just kept the pots for himself, maybe even sold them. And pots for northern Africa like that would be something very valuable. So if you take a look at the picture here, you see a man from Morocco in North Africa, and those pots with the high chimney lids on them, those are called tagines. They're used to cook food at a fairly low temperature for a long time, and the heat stays in, but the steam can escape. Most of the time, these things would be made of earthenware. They'd be made of clay or stoneware or something like that. But every once in a while, and I think this might be one right here, I'll draw a circle around it. It's hard to tell from the picture. Sometimes they're made of brass or copper. And those are elements that would have to be imported from somewhere else. So they're very valuable. And pots were sometimes treated in this region almost like currency, where you could trade them in exchange for other goods. The personification, this last part here, how does the narrator use personification? That's pretty clear. The idea that pots can live and have babies and die is a form of personification, giving those human characteristics to an inanimate object. All right, so that's all we have today for Goha and the pot. If you've been assigned, look in Schoology to see if there are any additional assignments, such as levels of thinking questions or a comparison contrast that you should do. I hope you enjoyed this little folk tale, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.